Why do you think you should be the next PFCC?
And that is a good question. I think the short answer is that we need a change. I think it's blatantly clear by the fact that we're in the position of a by-election that the way that we've been doing things before hasn't been working. And what better a change than, first of all, a young woman in the position, but also somebody who's not a career politician, somebody who's in it for motivations beyond, political gain. And I'd like to think that that's me.
And what are those motivations?
So I've got a younger sister, and I worry chronically about her going out. I tell her to only go out in groups of 3 or 4 girls. I tell her begrudgingly, make sure that one of your guy friends is with you. And actually, I shouldn't have to be thinking that my sister needs to be carrying her car keys between her fingers on nights out. And that's a position that, I've been in myself. And I think the circumstances of the by-election have proven that there's a yawning disconnect in the people that have had the role of the PFCC currently, and actually how people are feeling about their personal safety, be it, young women, be it members of the LGBTQ plus community, be it, people who've been targeted by racial attacks. I think people are genuinely worried. And I think that there is a lack of trust there between these people and the police.
And obviously in the last election, Labour was not voted in.
Yeah.
Why do you think they'll want you now?
I think this might just be the straw that broke the camel's back, because like you're right, the last election was not that long ago. It feels like we're living in a weird political fever dream by which each day is just Groundhog Day of the last. But yeah, we were in this position and the Labour candidate didn't get chosen. By that point, by the last election, we were already in the position where we were reflecting upon the case of Sarah Everard. But I don't think we'd actually got to the point yet where we realised just how desperately change was needed. I think sometimes things have to get to breaking point before we appreciate that we do need to change how we're doing things.
And obviously, because of the Sarah Everard attacks, you mentioned it, I'm going to carry on with that. Trust in the police is very, very low. Yeah. How are you going to change that?
Yeah, so trust in the police is something that, I'm passionate about from 2 perspectives. The first being sort of, as a young woman myself, I will cross the street on a dark night if I've got somebody following behind me, regardless of whether or not they're a police officer, because I don't feel safe, police officer or not, out on the streets at night. My parents were police officers. Combined, they did 60 years service. They did 30 years each before they retired. They did that in the hopes of creating a better community, a safer environment for myself and my sister to grow up in. And in light of the Sarah Everard case, they actually asked me, what was the point in any of it? They'd done 30 years each and trust is still chronically low, and they sort of didn't see any change at all in the political landscape and certainly in the landscape of which people need to trust the police. And yeah, they said, what's the point? And I think the point is that they had very good intentions, but actually that something needs to change at the top, because we have fantastic people like my parents who want to make a difference, but we need to give them the tools and the resources to make that difference with. So
how are you going to do that change?
Yeah, so I think first of all, there needs to be more transparency and accountability within the police. So myself, I'm training to be a paramedic. So by the time I get my HCPC registration, if there are any complaints about me, that gets put onto the HCPC website, which means Joe Blogs on the street can Google my name and establish whether or not there's been any allegations put against my name, regardless of whether or not they're proven to be true. Those allegations will be made clear. Currently, there's nothing to say that is possible of the police. You can have a police officer who's attending somebody equally as vulnerable as a paramedic is attending, and yet you still have no right to know if they've had allegations put against them in the past. That to me is wrong, because if somebody's coming to my house at 3 a.m. at the point where I've reached crisis, I want to know that I can trust that person. And I think that's a massive issue, and that's something that we need to sort of establish, is this level of transparency so that we can start to rebuild trust within the police.
So you want to basically form a log where you can
take
Google
complaints seriously.
PFC,
yeah, absolutely.
Police officer and find out allegations made.
Yeah, people have the right to know who's looking after them and who's serving them in the community. So yeah, absolutely.
And so what are we've mentioned a couple of things you want to get done. Yeah. What are your 3 main priorities?
So tackling the endemic of violence against women and girls, but that goes beyond women and girls and also into other communities as well, which have previously been marginalised and also have had terrible experiences with the police because the police don't represent or understand them. So like I mentioned before, your LGBTQ plus communities, your BAME communities, all of whom have sort of historically not had a great relationship with the police. And I think part of that reason is that, you know, currently, for example, 97.8% of the police force as of May 2020 were white. You know, we have this sort of huge lack of representation within the police. So that's something that I'm very passionate about as well. I think,
and how are you actually going to change that?
Yeah, with my magic wand. Did I not mention that? I think we need to establish why, first of all, 97.8% of police officers are white. You know, that's not reflective of our county. So why is it that we're struggling to recruit, you know, police officers who aren't white? Is it because it's a very unappealing landscape to look at if you're not white, if you're, you know, if you don't fit the status quo? Why would you want to join the police? Because it's something that doesn't reflect your personal values and the values of your community. So I think we need to establish firstly why there's that lack of representation, and then look at sort of moving forward from that. Because without establishing why, we're never going to move on and have a sort of more representative police force. Yeah.
And you can carry on with your other priorities.
My other priorities. So county line gangs and drug dealing is also a massive problem in North Yorkshire, particularly in your sort of increasingly so in rural communities as well, but especially in coastal locations like Scarborough. We're seeing an increase of county line gangs moving to those locations to groom vulnerable people, not just young people, but from all sort of vulnerable people at risk of that sort of grooming from gangs. I think there needs to be certainly better education programs about the consequences. A lot of people, you know, start running favours for people that they think are friends that, you know, it would transpire grooming them, and they don't realise the repercussions that they're putting themselves at risk of, you know. And you can understand actually to an extent why somebody with no sort of, you know, community network, no support network would be drawn into that line of crime. And actually, I think if we're talking about victim support, there is less need for victim support at the point where there are less victims. So let's nip crime in the bud before it happens. I'm a big advocate for education. I think, you know, that is the way forward in my mind. So yeah, education on county line gangs and drug dealing. And something else that I'm very passionate about is safer roads in North Yorkshire. So as a student paramedic, I have been at the scene of some horrific, you know, instances of road traffic collisions. That's not always high speed. You know, people think that that's people driving 90 miles an hour on a 30, and it's not always the case. Sometimes it can be people have lost concentration at 35 miles an hour, and the consequences are devastating. So I think you know, a lot needs to be done in terms of making the roads of North Yorkshire safer. But yeah, ending the sort of endemic of violence against women and girls has to come top priority in light of the circumstances of the by-election.
And we, of course, advocate for student, you know, issues as a student radio station. You've been sent a student safety pledge by our USU Community and Wellbeing Officer.
Yes.
Are you going to sign up to that pledge?
Without a doubt, yeah. So something that, you know, I've got to be in my bonnet at the moment is the fact that we were meant to have a hustings here on Monday in regards to student safety, young people's safety, particularly in like spiking. And I know how much USU have been doing also to sort of raise awareness for young people's safety. Now, unfortunately, as I'm sure you know, that hustings did not go ahead because 2 candidates decided not to take part. That for me is a massive issue. I think we are sort of increasingly demanding that young people engage with politics and then fail to listen to them on the issues that matter to them, and yet we still berate them for not being involved in a landscape that doesn't reflect.
Of course, spiking is a huge issue, and it does fit very nicely into the reasons for this by-election. It's a worry for a lot of people.
Yeah.
What are you going to do to tackle it?
So there's, I've heard a couple of times mentioned, you know, let's give women and vulnerable people litmus strips to test their own drinks. Now, for me, we should not be policing the actions of the victims in crimes. At the point where we start demanding that people take responsibility for making sure that their drinks aren't spiked, we're going down a very slippery slope of victim blaming. Well, why didn't you check your drink, and why didn't you have test strips out with you? And I just think that is a dangerous route to go down. I think we need to have schemes by where licensed premises are aware of the best ways to keep their patrons on their premises safe. I think we need to have checks on doors to make sure that people aren't carrying substances that can potentially be used for spiking purposes. Because like I say, I appreciate the merits of perhaps, you know, carrying testing strips, and that might give some people comfort. But we shouldn't be making victims police their own behaviours, in absence of repercussions of the persecutors.
And how do you get to the root issue of the course of, no, that was bad phrasing. How do you get to the root issue of spiking? Yeah, absolutely. So, and if I had all of the answers, Lord knows I'd capitalise on it, and I don't. And I think it's a case of the more you know, the more you know you don't know, and I don't know everything. I wish I did. But how do you sort of get to the root cause of that issue? I'm not entirely sure. We need to establish why the substances that are being used to spike individuals are so readily available. That needs to be a priority. Where are we getting substances that are being used to spike? And also, how are we getting to a point where, a young girl goes out for a smoke break on a club, and she then becomes a target? Why are we not having, community sort of organisations making sure that vulnerable people staggering out of clubs aren't sort of in a compromising position? And just really briefly, sum up your campaign for me in like a couple of words.
My campaign is, I think we need a change. And what's gone before hasn't worked. I've had plenty of criticism on my age. I think if age was to equate to wisdom, we wouldn't be in the position of the by-election, because the incumbent wouldn't have said the things that he did, but he did. So yeah, something needs to give, and I think it's time for a change.
Brilliant. Thank you ever so much,
Emma.
Very much. And we wish all the candidates the best.
Broadcasting to York University. You are why.